This is a difficult class because all these things are interlinked. And how you write them is, there's no tricks, there's no catchy Kamoka things that you can do with character. It really is a question of listening to your own writing and deciding what it is. What is the voice you want to tell this story with? Hello, everybody. Now, I know we had a really interesting session last week and, worked with characters and dialogue and stuff. And that was, I was quite stimulated by all that afterwards. And I also actually really liked the fact that I gave you guys a chance to write a bit as well. So I'm going to try to do that this time as well. There's a couple of things we could be working on. I noticed, back when I was discussing these workshops with VPL, there was talk about what should we call each one, and I came up with all these sort of various titles, and I realized that this particular one was "All Your Questions Answered," which is really quite a grand boast. I'm not sure I'm going to do all your questions. We're going to save a lot of those, all the questions I haven't answered in the course of the 7 workshops up till then. I'm going to deal with a lot of those in the 8th workshop. But I am going to deal with the questions around voice, tone, pacing, particularly today. And so, do keep those questions coming. I want to take time out to handle those. So, without further ado, I'll get going. As you know, I always try to do a little recap of the sort of essence of what it is that I do with these workshops, the essence of the mountain as an idea, just for those who haven't perhaps been with me before, or those who are still a little hazy around the whole concept of the novel as a series of ascents. What I always talk about is that writing a novel is a process. It's not, and it's a series of stages. So it's not reaching a destination straight away on each draft. It's focusing on each draft as very much its own thing, with an imperative all its own. And when I talk about climbing the mountain on the different drafts, I have certain rules. One of which, of course, is you remove the words good and bad from your vocabulary. I always think you should remove those from your vocabulary as a method of looking at your own work anyway, because what good are they? If it's good, you feel puffed up. If it's bad, or you call it bad, you're going to feel let down and deflated. So I would remove those from your vocabulary entirely. It's all going to be a matter of what works and what doesn't work. The other thing I do with each draft is really the idea of don't look down. Certainly the first draft, don't look down the mountain when you're climbing it because you might fall off. Don't look back too much. A little sometimes rereading of a couple of pages, but don't be entirely finishing off chapter 1 before you move on to chapter 2. I think that is going to halt your progress. It's like climbing the mountain, but stopping at this point and going, "Ooh, it's really clever how I climbed to this point. Let me look at that again," as opposed to getting up the mountain. And that other rule that I have with the first draft is don't show your first draft to anyone. I think it's an idea that is really born out of the first draft. Certainly should be about absolute and total freedom from concerns of anything being grammatical or spelled correctly or even, flowing properly or anything. They should be concerned about getting the story out. It shouldn't definitely be concerned about matters of taste. Taste is almost indefinable because each one's taste is different. So don't worry too much about other people's taste. Don't worry about your mother reading it because she's not going to read it, because you're not going to show it to her. So she'll never know you have those thoughts about that. Okay. So, the big emphasis I always have is, and we're not going to delve into it quite so much this workshop, but it's about character. Novels are always about character. And that final thing I say, which is and if anyone hasn't heard me say it, they're going to go, "What?" but it is that I firmly believe that writing is writing. And it sounds so simplistic, but for me, it's absolutely true that all the other stuff you can do, including attending these workshops, which can stimulate ideas, hopefully, and absolutely. But it really, when it comes down to the moment of writing, something else happens, especially if you can let go, especially if you can not judge, especially if you can just keep going, because the brain is a wonderful thing. I don't claim to be a brain scientist, but I know that it works in magical ways. And if almost what I teach is getting out of your own way. So without further ado, let's come on to the main subject of, or subjects of today. And that is voice, POV, or otherwise known as point of view, pacing, which I think I'm going to deal with last, and tone. I'm going to deal with voice and tone to start with. And it's interesting if you're considering when you're really thinking about these things, it is actually in every part of the journey. It's from the first draft on. I wouldn't really recommend saying I'm going to write it in this voice. And what do I mean by voice? Well, voice is really the voice that the reader hears when they read your work. What is that voice? What does it sound like to them? Is it for example, who's telling the story? Is it an unseen narrator? You come gather around and hear the story. Is it straight into a character? And why it links up with tone, which we'll talk more about later, but it is different because the voice is kind of what they hear, the tone of voice. It's clear, isn't it? Something else. What I thought would be sort of easier than blathering on too much is actually to give you an example, a few examples of voice from my own work. And I'm going to use, since even though this workshop is aimed at people who are writing in any genre, really, the mountain is useful for any genre. The emphasis in these workshops has been, if there is a specific emphasis, on fantasy. So I'm going to start with a couple of things, and it's interesting because the voice, what the reader hears, is set up, of course, from the very first sentence, the very first paragraph, the first, not quite the first word, because you need something to balance it against, but it's set up in the beginning. And you can tell really what the voice, or I think you should be able to tell what the voice of the book is going to be, what the reader is going to hear, almost from the beginning. So I'll talk about my very first novel, The French Executioner, which I think has my favorite ever first sentence, partly because it set it up. It set up the story. It's like a lot of my stuff, and this is something we can again talk about, perhaps in regard to pacing as well, is that it begins with that time-worn Latin phrase, in media res, in the middle of things. Beginnings, I think we'll probably deal a lot with beginnings in maybe in workshop 8, how to jump into a novel. But the first sentence of The French Executioner, which I know is historical fiction, kind of, but it's been published, for example, in German as fantasy, and because it is really more historical fantasy. And it began with the sentence, "It was unseasonably cold for a late May night, but the former occupant of the gibbet was too dead to care, and his replacement too unconscious." It's one of my favorite sentences, partly because it began my writing career, my novelist writing career. But also, if you look at it as an example of voice, the first voice you really hear there is a narrator style voice. And it's one of those things that I love deeply, which is the idea of your come to me and hear a story. Luring people into your story is what you have to do from the very beginning. And you're going to use all the tools that we've already talked about, character objectives and beginning in the middle of things, and all those things to hook the reader. Because one of the things I've talked about often in these workshops is the idea that you need to keep the reader reading. That's the number one thing for any scene. Keep the reader reading. Yes, it's great if it develops the character. Yes, it's great if it advances the plot. But any sentence really has to make the reader want to read the next sentence. Fortunately, that paragraph goes on in that sort of style. But there's that voice. I'll give you a slightly different example. This is from my. Oh, no, do I have it? Do I even have it here? That would be annoying if I don't. I know I lent a copy to someone. I was going to read you from The Hunt of the Unicorn. Is a fantasy novel I wrote ostensibly for young adults, though I'm always a bit dubious about the differentiation between aiming for young adults and adult readers. I know a lot of adult readers have read this one. And in a way, this speaks slightly to tone as well, but I'll tell you why about that afterwards. Let's just think about voice here. And of course, the journey begins with a cover, right? It might even begin with someone reading the back cover, but it certainly begins with chapter 1, which in this case is called The Book. And in italics at the top of the page, it says, "Thunderstorms rumble nearer, the air charged with static, as sticky hot as only a New Orleans night can be. Arcana knows that the werewolf is going to come. She prays that all the precautions she's taken are not in vain, prays that he's brought the goal of her quest." Elaine, she jumped. She was not in an old mansion in Louisiana, but in her bedroom in New York. And no muscle-bound werewolf stood in her doorway. Her dad did, skinny as a stick. "Sorry," her father said. "Did I interrupt something?" Reading, homework, you know." "Well, if you're busy." With a sigh, he pushed himself off the doorframe. She could see the effort it took. "Are you okay?" He reached out a hand to steady himself. "Fine, I was reading this." He held up a book, fell asleep, began to have the strangest dream. "What about?" He smiled. "You." So, I mean, it does several things, that, of course. It obviously sets up the story. It sets up her escape from the world she's in, where her father's obviously not well. We'll discover he, in fact, has cancer. It's not too much of a spoiler. It happens very quickly. But the voice of the story is there straight away. And it's done in mainly in dialogue, actually. But it has that sort of crispness. And one last one, by way of comparison. And this is, again, in Germany, they call this, no, you know what? I'm going to save that one Vlad, for the tone discussion. But let's just have a look here at the fantasy novel. This is the series I have out right now. It's called Smoke in the this is called Smoke in the Glass. The series is called Immortal's Blood. And this has a very different opening, partly because the voice changes slightly, which I think is interesting. And we'll discuss why that happens and why it's different. So, chapter 1, Trial by Death. Of the two men who lay beside each other on the ridge, watching the kidnappers camp, one was to take a mortal wound that night, the other a wound that would make him live forever. Neither could know it, for the gods had not cursed them with the far-seeing eye. Neither would have cared if they had known. Half odds are good odds was a law they lived by in the hills of the Sarfadi, where death was so easy to come by. Both would have taken the bet and gone to grave or immortality with a gambler's accepting smile. Neither cared about anything other than what they did next. About that, they cared a great deal, and because of it, the two men, closer than brothers, did what they rarely did, quarreled in short, angry whispers. because I claimed it first, only because I did not think you would be so stupid as to do so. Stupid. As the chicken without a head, as the donkey following its tail, as the Ashtan, Ferosh held up his hand to halt his friend's comparisons before he went round the farmyard. How often must I prove it? I am better at the close work. So again, you see, it's obviously in media res, but it starts with the voice of the narrator. It starts with that thing of, come gather ye and hear a tale. And then it goes into character, which is really where the rest of the story is told. Apart from little, I don't like switching voices very much. I don't like alternating, certainly in the same page, which I do here, between narrator and character. You can do that sometimes in chapters. If you have a character chapter and a narrator chapter, you can sort of change voice there. But you don't want to do it too much, I don't think. It could be a bit jarring. So those are the three quite different examples of how voice can be used. How a voice sets you up. Voice draws the reader in. And I'm sure in your own work, because I know you've all got things going hard at it, you'll already have a sense of what your voice is. Now, what is a good idea, I think, is to maybe on that second climb up the mountain, on the second climb more. The first climb up the mountain, when you're just writing the first draft and you're not looking down, remember, that first climb, you're not going to be as concerned with voice. You remember its process, and your initial climb is not about fixing things like that too much. Voice tends to be something that happens a little more naturally. You'll find yourself dropping into a way of telling the story. Now, if you discover on your second draft that your voice changes a lot, unless that's for very specific reasons to do with character or the type of story you happen to be telling at that particular moment in a book, which can change, of course. If you're moving from heavy historical fantasy into Gothic horror in the same book, which happens, which I do sometimes, only then will you need to really pay attention. And it might even be a transition of voice. It's very interesting thinking about voice, because it is one of those natural things. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it, or you know it when you hear it. So I would suggest on different aspects, different timings of your books when you're writing, when you're doing the second draft, have a run through of it almost, or certainly part of it, thinking, is this just changed voice? Is this not how the book was being told before? Might be a good reason for it, but you need to be wary of it, because a change of voice can jolt the reader out of the thing you want him to be doing, which is reading the next line. As I say, it's one of those things that is slightly indefinable, but as I say, you know it when you hear it. I'm going to get you to do a little exercise, because remember I said that was a good thing. So I'd like you to start with a blank piece of paper. And I'm going to give you a scenario from Fantasy World. A dragon wakes up in a cave. Now, you can decide the how of it, what kind of dragon, comedy dragon, terrifying dragon. You can the who, what, when, why, where is kind of up to you. But I'd like you to set it in media res, set it with the action, describe the action happening, and choose a kind of voice. Choose, well, actually, in this thing, I'd like you to, no, tell a lie. I'd like you to use a narrator's voice for this. Just play with what it's like to start with, not from character. Fafnir woke and thought, geez, I'm so hungry. No, none of that. Don't do that. Do a sort of, the dragon woke in the cave. kind of thing. And I'm just going to let you do it for 5 minutes because I just want you to get an idea. Once each of you have written a passage, I think you'll be able to tell what the voice for that particular story is. All right? So it's quite simple. A dragon is woken in a cave by a noise. That's what I wanted to say. A dragon is woken in a cave by a noise. And, get as far as you can into the action. But start in the action, but start it with with an external voice, a narrator's voice. All right? I'm going to come back in 5 minutes. Okay? All right, everybody. You could put your pens down. It's like that MasterChef thing, isn't it? Step away. Time's up. If anyone's got any comments about that, feel free to add them to the chat, or any specific questions on what you just did. I have some questions for you, and I think it's probably interesting. I mean, did you find that you happened upon a voice quite quickly? And also, and this is where we're going to go into something a bit different, is did the voice lend it a tone? As I said at the beginning, voice and tone are inextricably linked, and they are separate things, because the voice might not be the tone, and vice versa. By tone, I tend to say that it differs from voice specifically in that you can probably ascribe an adjective to it. Maybe it's rich, maybe it's funny, maybe it's bitter, maybe it's angry, maybe it feels removed or very present. It's interesting that I put all these three things in a workshop together because we're also going to talk about POV, or point of view, and that again can absolutely set both your voice and your tone. I'm going to come on to POV later, but I'll tell you a quick story because it factors into tone. When I set out to write The Hunt of the Unicorn for Knopf in New York, I decided to write it first person, present tense. Now and we're going to come on to this in POV, as I say, but here is why it linked to tone. I normally write, and after this ill-advised venture, I continued to write in third person past tense. He went to the door, not I go to the door. And when I delivered the delivery draft to my editor, she went, yeah, well, it's good, Chris. They always say it's good to start with. But what the first person does is that the tone is a bit snarky. Is that what you wanted? Which is always the question an editor should ask. Is that what you wanted? And it was definitely not what I wanted. But in my efforts I just spent 2 years channeling Vlad the Impaler, so I felt I could channel a 15-year-old Manhattan girl. Obviously not to good effect the first time through. And it did, and I realized what she meant. The whole tone of the book, not just her dialogue and everything, but because she was the narrator, the whole tone was snarky, and that colored the voice that the reader was hearing as well. I didn't want it. I went back and rewrote it third person past, which was a huge amount of work. If anyone thinks that you're just changing the I to she, it's just not true. You have to change every single sentence. But that was an example, and I will come on and discuss point of view and its advantages and disadvantages again. But tone can also be very much linked to style, the style of the book. And I've got two examples for you here. One is my novel Chasing the Wind, which is about a 1930s aviatrix called Roxy Loeb. And I wanted to write, I'm kind of obsessed by, and I really wanted to write something that was in a noir style. I love noir movies. I love noir novels from the 30s and 40s. And so I thought that since I was writing a novel about an aviatrix in the 1930s, I would get that sort of feel to it. So I'll just read you the opening, and you'll get an idea of tone here. Chapter 1, Crash. Curtis Field Aerodrome, Long Island, November the 2nd, 1929. The pilots took shelter in the hangar and kept their ear flaps down. The storm had struck like a sudden military assault. The phosphorus flash of lightning, the cannon crump of thunder, hail hammering the tin roof like bullets from a Tommy gun. Having pounded the aerodrome, it gathered ferocity and headed west to fall on New York City and wreak its havoc there. Everyone moved to the wide doorway, straining to listen beyond the departing storm for the sound they all wanted and needed to hear. There! One pilot stepped out and the rest followed, their leather jackets instantly glistening in the rain that was softening to mist. They squinted against it to the low gray ceiling of cloud. Now they all heard it, an engine's throaty cry. It's, you get I'm sure you get the idea from even that. It goes on in a similar tone. There's a noirish tone to it. I wanted that to be clear. So when we're, and I'm going to get you to do another quick little exercise. I don't want to occupy too much time with exercises, but I will get you to do a little quick exercise to play with what you've already written. One other example before I get you to do that is, this is my novel Vlad. This is the English edition, which is rather glorious. They've cost them extra money to red roll the pages. Isn't that wonderful? Anyway, I very much wanted, because I was not writing a book, a lot of people complained, well, quite a few complained, that where's the vampire? Because it's about the real Dracula. There is no vampire. It's about the real Dracula. But what I decided right from the beginning was that I needed almost to nod to that whole idea of the vampire. So I chose to write it in a kind of Gothic style. And that, again, I'll just read you. It's much easier to read it than explain it. Chapter 1, The Summons. Wallachia, March 1481. All was still in the forest. The last snowflakes of the sudden storm had just fallen. Everything paused. In the crook of a copper beech sat a man. His arms were crossed, gloved hands folded into his lap, the right beneath to support the weight of the goshawk on his left. They had been there for a long time, as long as the blizzard lasted. Man and bird, part of the stillness, part of the silence. Both had their eyes closed. Neither were asleep. Again, it gets more Gothic because there's a whole, storytelling that happens in a dungeon of a castle around a fire. But that, again, you could the tone of that just sets it up from the beginning. Again, in media res, you start with a man in a tree and a hawk. I mean, it's a pretty good beginning, really. But tone can often speak to that sort of style. As I said right at the beginning, this is a difficult class because all these things are interlinked, and how you write them is there's no tricks, there's no catchy Kamoka things that you can do with character. It really is a question of listening to your own writing and deciding what it is. What is the voice you want to tell this story with? How, and that can evolve. It might not be something you impose at the beginning. It can should evolve out of the story itself and the characters. Everything is linked, right? Everything is meshed together. Trying to separate out all these little aspects of the writing craft is actually quite a tricky thing to do sometimes. Clearer when you've got, objectives and research how to use it and all that sort of stuff. Trickier, but fascinating in how you then, and that's why I think a lot of this stuff is to do more with later drafts, because it's part of the polish that happens later. It's part of the edit that happens later. Just very quickly, I might not even give you that long on this one, a few minutes, but I'd love you to go back to that passage you just wrote and change the tone of it for me. Just start writing it again, but do it snarky. Do you all know what I mean by snarky? I mean, just like kind of, this dragon is kind of pissed off and bitter and not angry so much as the world, what a place. Just write it like that, just for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back again. All right. I just wanted to it just gives you an idea of what a change of tone can do, which you might be able to use in your own writing. Okay, here we go. Hello, and we're back. Again, I'm doing I'm making you work quite quickly today, but I'm just hoping you're getting a sense of this. It is a vast topic, this, and could really probably do with several sessions. But I'm hoping that just the little things that you've done. I mean, it's not like I'm reinventing the wheel here, by the way. I'm pretty sure you all have a sense of what voice and what tone is and what it can do. It changes a book, obviously. You know, if you're writing something in a very Gothic style, you're aiming to draw the reader into that sort of style. It might be there might be what the reader buys the book for. They want to hear a Gothic tale, or they might want to hear a noir tale, something like that. But the voice, that voice that the reader actually hears, the author's voice, and then the tone that is over that, whether it's all those things it could be. I just got you to make your dragons a bit snarky. That might be the way you want to go. It might not. Snarky can wear pretty thin after a while, I think. But interesting idea. We haven't got much longer, so I want to talk about the sort of the third thing we set out to deal with here. I might not get to pacing today. I think that's something that I really need to deal with in the next session, because that's more to do with second and third draft stuff, which I'm really going to cover next week. But I definitely want to deal with person and tense. And by person, I mean in the grammatical sense. Is your book being told in the first person? Is it being told in the third person? Is the tense present tense? Is it? I never know what this is. Past definite or something. I used to study Latin for years. I should probably know what all these things are called. But you know the example. I mean, every example I've read today has been in that third person past tense, which conversely becomes very immediate. It's not like you're thinking, oh, this is all happening in the past, right? It's actually happening now in front of you. It's just not happening in the present tense. Now, there are authors out there, wonderful authors, who write in every conceivable permutation. Hilary Mantel writes in the second person, present tense. You, she says a lot. Drives me crazy. I can't read her, but that's something else. The choice you make around it, and I think it's probably a choice. I know I say just start out and start climbing the mountain, but the choice you make around such a thing is going to set the voice and the tone, and indeed the style for a lot of your books. So it's something you do want to think about before you set out. How am I going to tell this story? There are advantages and disadvantages to each one. The people who love the first person present tense swear to its immediacy. It's true. You're right there, right in it. It's happening there and then. The disadvantage of a first person perspective is that you can't give other people's perspectives unless they tell you something, and they might be lying. Right? So it's harder to get at the truth. A first person perspective also can lead to that wonderful thing called the unreliable narrator. The classic example of that would be Catcher in the Rye. He's a snarky, unreliable narrator, if you remember the beginning of that book. So that set very much, Salinger very much set the tone for that with the way he began that book. So there are, I wouldn't presume to give you, I know what works best for me, and you'll find what works best for you and for the story. I've written one short story which works more in the first person. Aside from that, all the stuff I do is third person. It just works for me. And too long in the tooth now to change that style, probably. Now, there's something else about the first person that I know it's very immediate. I actually find it harder to read being stuck in one person's viewpoint all the time. So again, that is probably a idiosyncratic thing. It's personal, but it's not the style I like to write in. It's not the style I like to read in particularly. Though I'm reading a fantasy book right now called Witchmark by the next author I'm going to be interviewing for the writer's desk on December the 9th, C.L. Polk. And she writes first person, present tense, and it's really well done. So maybe I'm talking nonsense. Maybe I am enjoying it. So let me just see here. It's coming up to time. So let's just see if there are any questions out there. Oh, good. Paul Levitt now wants to write a story about a dragon. That's good. I've written one. It's called The Hunt of the Dragon, so you can't use that title. Apart from that, here's Paul Carter. Do you find it can work to switch between first person and third person narrative? For example, between diary entries and a general narrative? Yeah, diaries, of course, are a slightly separate thing. But, Paul, it always comes down to whatever works, remember. That's the key. If you can make that switch, I think diary entries and, if your general narrative is third person, but you switch into I did this, I did that. I use letters sometimes. People seem to write each other letters in my books because I like writing letters. Which is quite a good way of conveying information and all that. Yeah, absolutely. You can switch then between first person and third person narrative. I think that works really well. Diary entries, letters. If you think about it, dialogue in a way is a first person kind of thing because each of the persons speaking is speaking in the first person. Right? I'm doing this. I disagree with you entirely. I'm going to shoot you now. They're all speaking first person then. So that happens in my books quite a lot. But I think the key, again, it comes down to whatever works. Does it feel jarring to switch to that? Is this a good point for a journal entry? Is it going to get in the way of the or a letter? Is it going to get in the way of what's happening in the rest of the plot? But absolutely, as a principle, you can certainly go and do a switch between first and third person. You don't want to be doing that in the middle of a scene. If you've been running third person, you don't want to suddenly. But though again, the person who's thinking it third person past tense, if they're thinking, I really don't like this person, he's got a gun, he's going to shoot me, I better shoot him first. That in a way changes into a type of first person, but the overall thing is not. So I'm by no means saying you have to stick to one thing in how you're relating. When you're going into a person's mind or viewpoint, when they have taken over and are telling the story, that's slightly different. That's not really switching to a first person narrative, though. That's you're just focusing on them within the third person framework. Does that make sense? Good. I know it's a couple of minutes early, but I'm tempted to leave you to sit with this unless there are any other questions, because it really is quite a mind blow that I've led you into here. It's if I was to try to summarize all this, I'd struggle. I think let me reframe it. I'll tell you what I'll do as a summary. I'll reframe it back to the idea of the mountain. When are you going to be considering these aspects? Well, as I said, with point of view, you're obviously going to be considering that from the beginning. As I am climbing the mountain. She was climbing the mountain. They set off up the mountain. Those are the sort of decisions you make quite early. No decision, by the way, because remember the other thing about the first draft is that no one's going to see it. No decision is irreversible. You might find I wrote a whole first draft, first person, present tense, and then realized that it wasn't the right one and rewrote it all. And of course, did a second draft as I rewrote the first one because of all the other notes I received at the same time. I'm a big advocate of the idea of playing and beginnings. As I said, I read you a lot of beginnings today. Beginnings are so important. They're going to set these things up for you. So so you might find yourself, I know I say don't look down, but you might find yourself needing to just make sure that how you began it is how you want to continue. Is this the voice you want to be accompanying you at the top of the mountain? Don't spend a lot of time looking down or correcting or doing that, but go over it again and think, or start again. What if I tried this third person? What if I tried this in a different, really put a different tone on it? What is the situation here? If you can bring it back to character, what's going to suit the character? In Chasing the Wind, I knew she was going to be, something out of the Frank Capra movie, Roxy Lowen. She's going to be tough, and she's going to be Carol Lombard would play her in the movie, if you remember her. Anyone remembers her? She's great. She's going to be wisecracking. She's going to be tough. She's going to hold her own against the men. The tone of her, I knew from the beginning, would fit the style of the story, which is going to be noirish. So I knew that before I set out. And therefore, not a lot changed in my journey up the mountain. But that was my 16th novel. So I probably sort of knew what I was doing by then. Again, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining me here. We'll reconvene in a week's time when I'll be back in my office.